So later tonight we have a field trip to the Ark of Anu out by the river, so anybody want to join us, we'll have a field trip, do a little pagan ritual there or something. Okay, I have a true story to tell you. There's this Jewish man who drives to the airport this is true by the way, drives to the airport to pick up his son who's been in Israel studying to be a rabbi. And of course, when you study to be a rabbi, you have to go and spend a year in Jerusalem. So the son's coming back, the father's going to pick him up. Father's very excited because, his son, he's going to be a rabbi. So he gets to the airport, son is there at baggage claim, he grabs the bags, brings it out. Son gets into the passenger side, he's looking at him, the son's kind of remorse, sort of morose and sad. He's not excited. You'd think he'd be excited. The father says, so what happened? You went to Israel, you're coming back, you're going to be a rabbi? Son says, well, Pop, I don't know how to tell you this, but while I was in Jerusalem, I converted to Christianity. I became a Christian. And the father goes, oy vey, you don't tell me this. They drive home in silence, and the father is very distraught, and he drops his son off. He goes to see his friend Maury. He goes to see Maury. Maury opens the door. Saul, my good friend, how are you? I understand you picked up your son coming back from Jerusalem today. Oy, Saul, I can't tell you how sad I am. I picked up my son, I put him in the car, and I asked him, how is it you're going to be a rabbi? And he says, he's going to be a Christian. He converted to being a Christian. Saul goes, oy vey, Maury, you don't tell me this. 2 months ago, my son came back from studying to be a rabbi in Jerusalem, and he said the same thing. And they say to each other, what should we do? Let's go talk to the rabbi. So they go talk to the rabbi, and they go and they sit down with the rabbi, and they explain the whole story. And the rabbi says, oy, you don't tell me. My son last year went to be a rabbi. Me, the rabbi. And he comes back and he's a Christian. And the two men say to the rabbi, what are we going to do? Oh, we must go into the temple and we must pray and ask God to have guidance. And they go into the temple and they start praying and they are extolling for the Most High One to tell them what they should do, and suddenly the building starts shaking and plaster is falling from the ceiling, and this big loud thunderclap happens, and the building splits in half, and this light comes right down in between them. And they're all sitting there looking at each other, not saying anything, and all of a sudden this voice comes out of the light. Yes, gentlemen, what can I do for you? And the rabbi says, God, Maury here, his son went to Jerusalem to study to be a rabbi, and he became a Christian. And then Saul, his son, went to study to be a rabbi, and he came back from Jerusalem a Christian. And my son, a rabbi, my son, he went to Jerusalem to study to be a rabbi, and he came back a Christian. And this is silence for a long time. And the voice says, oy, your sons too? It's a true story. So with that, it's a true story. Let's start with some questions.
Ask that question, Ken?
What about your son and the rabbi?
Yeah, the son of the rabbi. I got a son. He went to Jerusalem to be a rabbi.
Yeah.
Now, I had asked you, my mother just passed away, and I'm the oldest surviving male in the family. Would I have to do something to claim her estate?
And the answer is, when you claim your estate, you're the lineal ancestral descent of that. It's not like there's an accumulative estate that you claim yours, you get so many billions, you claim your mom's, and so many more billions. And it has nothing to do with what we define as money or, all of these patriotic myths and fantasies about we'll get the black card and we can buy everything we want, and et cetera. It really is, first and foremost, as far as I'm concerned, whether we quote unquote get anything out of the estate is secondary and really immaterial. What we want is standing and solvency to disconnect from the encumbrances and the franchise and everything. But with that standing, we can state a claim, and I think the rest remains to be seen. So it's not quantitatively, more. It's that we become we're the end of the line of abandoning the estate to the global estate executor control system. And I think there's a lot more that's going to be revealed as we get into it and truly complete and perfect all of this.
Ken, this has been a great weekend, I know, for a lot of us, especially for me. Just a couple questions. When you, I think I get this name wrong, but Sabatier?
Sabatier.
Okay.
Yeah.
When he made this edict that we're going to do the opposite of established
Right.
norms, do you know about what year that was? Can I ask? I'm not
Well, he was born in 1636, and somewhere around 1686, so at about the age of 50. Now remember what was going on at that time. If you're inclined to read books anymore, there's a great book, I was just talking about it, forget who I was just talking about it with, called The Defenders of the Faith. And it's all about the period just after Columbus in 1492 into the early 1520s, 1530s, 1536, which was an extraordinary pivot point of history. The Ottoman Empire was perfected, so to speak. I mean, it was consolidated under the one of his names. I mean, he's called many things, a big poobah in Suleiman, and basically the head of the Ottoman Empire, based in Constantinople and or Istanbul. And on the eastern side, the Islamic side, and then on the western side, in around 1520, the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, Carlos V, became the Holy Roman Emperor. And so that initiated the Spanish ascendancy in the Spanish Empire, taking over all of Latin America, creating it to be all Catholic and all the rest of it. In the meantime, you had Henry VIII starting to do his thing in around mid to late 1520s, starting to move towards disconnecting from from Rome and creating the Anglican Church and all of that. And all kinds of things were going on in Rome. It's one of the most extraordinary histories, and that book is quite incredible. So I really recommend that book. And then, of course, in 1536, you have Loyola, who was a Spanish priest, and he was in the Southwest, the so-called Four Corners, and I interacted with some people in, actually, when I talked about the Dominion of Melchizedek and the next iteration of what we tried to do as a jurisdiction, which is a very long story, and I'm not going to tell it tonight. It's a fascinating story, and it relates to the modern events going on with Indonesia and China and the RV, which we will get to next. And maybe I'll tell a little bit of the story, but the short version is that in attempting to do that jurisdiction, one of I lost my train of thought. The drugs are starting to wear off. Yeah, well, okay, no, it's not just the four corners. Oh, well, Loyola, I know why I was going to say that. Okay, because some of that group of people were involved in some very primary deep research into the archives of the Spanish Empire in Seville, and finding the original records of the Southwest and the Four Corners, what was going on, the so-called El Dorado. Because if you look at the history of what happened 1492, Cortez landed in the year 1519 and in what's called Veracruz now, and with just a couple hundred soldiers and some horses, made a direct beeline to Mexico, what we call Mexico City, which in the Aztec language, the name for that was Tenochtitlan. Titlan in that language means city. Tenoch, or T, followed by E-N-O-C-H, you recognize that name? Enoch. Okay, so Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, was really Enoch's city. So whoever really was Enoch in that period, 2000, 2500 BC, and things going on in the British Isles and otherwise, obviously was here in the Americas, and those records, without any doubt in my mind, were taken back and eventually ended up in the hands of the Vatican and so forth. So they knew exactly where they were going. And so, because in any military process, a couple hundred soldiers landing on a totally foreign coastline are not going to just do a beeline up the mountains and find Tenochtitlan and then manipulate Montezuma and so forth and basically conquer the Aztecs. There was, if you study, which I have, the Aztec history, the Mayans and the Aztec and so forth, they were expecting them, okay? They literally expected a white bearded male to land on the shores of Mexico, what we call Mexico, on the day that he landed. It's precisely a date in the Mayan calendar that they expected it to happen. The Mayan calendar is structured in one way. There's 17 layers of the Mayan calendar. One of them is called the 13 heavens and the 9 hells, and each one of those is a 52-year unit of time. From 1519 to 1987 was that period of the 9 hells. 9 times 52 is whatever that is, 468. And that they expected it literally on the Mayan calendar, which the Aztecs also incorporated on that specific day. So there was a lot of, obviously, multi-dimensional things going on how I described that plane of on and so forth. So Cortez came straight to Tenochtitlan, conquered it, and we know the myth, the fantasy, the legend of El Dorado, the 7 cities of gold. Well, they also knew about that. They went straight to the Four Corners after they took control of what we call Mexico. And they knew there was gold there. So when these guys researched in Seville, the archives, the quantity of gold that was being taken out of that Four Corners area. Now keep in mind also, there's 2 places on the planet that the symbol of the swastika originated in. One was in Tibet, and one was in the Four Corners, in the Hopi. Okay, so they went straight there, and the quantity of gold had no relationship to the amount of mining that was taking place. There was huge amounts of gold, and they were carrying it down a trail or a pathway where they would carry them on mules, and the mules would be packed to the maximum, and whatever mule died, they had to store that gold somewhere along the way. There's vast amounts of gold stored along that path from the Four Corners down to Corpus Christi and Galveston that was then shipped back to Spain. So the reason I tell you that is because Loyola was a priest on that pathway, on that trail. And that's where he got his download, his revelation that he was to create the Jesuits. So he went straight to Rome after he got his boat ride back, and basically told the Pope who he was, and that's where the Jesuits started. So that was 1536. So in that period of time, all of these things were happening simultaneously. Coincidence? So remind me what your question was, because it related to that.
Just the year at Sabbatia and the...
Oh, yeah. So the reason I tell you that is because that started the Jesuit phase of history. So the Jesuits and that whole period, the Jesuits, then 1540 started what was called the Council of Trent, that lasted 24 years, and they game planned the next 500 years. That same time frame as the Hyksos kings took over Egypt, 3,000 years ago, and how they were going to perfect the New World Order. Well, then along comes in 1636, which is right in the middle of what's called the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, where all of Europe was being reshuffled. And here comes vis-a-vis Sabbatia saying he's the Messiah. And then out of that emerges Amstel Rothschild, Meyer Amstel Bauer, who became Rothschild, Bauer that became Bayer aspirin, and all the pharmaceutical companies. And basically all of what took over banking, took over Europe, and so forth, emerged from that. And I haven't seen any source documents or anything that confirms it, but I have read in a couple places that the presumption or the belief is that Rothschild, the original Rothschild, was a grandson of Sabbatia, okay? And then founded the 13 families, and basically from early 1700s through the 1700s, basically started fulfilling the game plan, working with the Jesuits. And of course, from the original Rothschild, you have 5 sons taking control of the 5 principal capitals of Europe, kind of like the obverse of the pentagram of the feminine, So these are the kind of things that I've pulled all these pieces together, and there is no coincidence. There is a pre-programmed agenda template, as I described earlier, that was accessed through the monoatomic gold, because in modern research that started around the mid-'80s, when you consume that, which I absolutely do not recommend at all, because it distorts all of the inner levels of who you really are in a way you do not want to do. So all of this new agey metaphysical, belief that, oh, this is the path to enlightenment, is not at all. And we don't need to get into the detail of that. But that was mostly lost throughout history, but there were other ways, through black magic, sex magic, trauma, ritual abuse, and so forth, that people were trained to be able to access that. So I have no doubt that there's a continuum through thousands of years, and then the last 300 to 400 years of being able to access that. So here comes Sabbatia incarnating and saying, well, I'm the Messiah, and here's the game plan. And then out of that emerges the Jesuit game plan, the Rothschild banking, and the rest that most of you, I'm sure, know the history of that.
Wow, that's a lot.
Let me interject this. We were talking a little bit at dinner that one of my goals has been for a long time that Gemstone, which the acronym is Global Educational Media, will evolve to become truly a global media group, and that we will gain and have the financial resources, which I know are coming very soon. Back to your question about the RV, which we'll get to in a minute, and what is about to happen in the shift. And the intention, which I'm sure we will fulfill, is building Gemstone to be a content development, media, and broadcasting group to start creating the documentaries, the animated sequences, films of any kind, to bring this real history forward and start breaking it open even more to reveal the truth of the matter and so forth.
Thank you. Just a question about Pantera, and maybe this is a silly question, but will it issue passports to its members, or how?
We
how
have
one?
2 or 3 possibilities, okay? AJ was just telling me about something he's involved in terms of a path that has been opened up for him with some friends of his to access international identity documents and through one level or another at the international level. That's something we are also pursuing through what we're doing with the Holy See and the research we found that we can go to that level. That's one possibility. Secondly, prior to that, about a year ago, we knew that if we completed everything that we're now very advanced in completing as far as the society and the cognizance I described earlier, that with the book of life and the individual claim of life, we would have the ability to create ID. And interestingly, one of our members, who is an Italian Catholic, who followed his own path in the 80s and 90s, creating corporations sole, but going through the diocese in San Francisco and the Archdiocese to the Vatican and actually getting it recognized through what path he followed, that one of the paths that he was opened up to was the fact that the parish notaries, as opposed to county notaries, parish as obviously being of the canon or ecclesiastical basis in Louisiana, that they're actually the Queen's notary, and that he knew people, knows people, and those people did commit to us to walk us through the process, that once we perfected the status correction and the claim of life, the book of life, we could take our own created ID to a parish notary and get it authenticated and apostilled, and it was equal to, in fact, somebody he knew, John, the man I'm talking about, actually did it, and when the notary handed him back the document that I'm sure wasn't even a tenth of what we've been creating, the notary said, now you understand, this is your travel document, you don't need anything else, okay?
If you use anything else, you're diminishing your status.
Right, yeah. So I still use the U.S. passport for the ease of, I go back and forth to Mexico, and if I have a couple of things pending, I may need to go overseas one direction or the other. But we're also working with somebody who's done a separate but somewhat comparable, say, status correction process, and through him I'm likely to get a diplomatic passport and have that door open as well. So whether we go through the Holy See and get the international passport through that avenue, or going through what I've just described and going to get documents authenticated and apostilled and then rescind the passport, you know, that's all coming relatively soon. And then the fourth possibility is that we're talking with the people at the World Service Authority. Everybody familiar with that? WSA? Have a look at WSA or World Service Authority on the internet, and they issue passports. And the story of that, very briefly, is a man named Gary Davis pioneered this in the late 40s, early 50s, and basically rescinded his U.S. citizen status and created a World Service passport and so forth. And Gary passed away about a year and a half ago, and we've been talking to the guy who's the head of that and telling him what we're doing, and also introducing him to what's going on with Indonesia. And for those of you who are already Pantera members and on Gemstone, that's a whole level which we can talk about in a few minutes, that also relates to the RV and the reset and everything else. And that's another likely avenue to have a passport. And possibly, we've talked to David, the head of World Service, about taking the 50 years or 60 years of development of what they've got. They've issued 1 million or more passports. They used to be fairly acceptable by a lot of jurisdictions, but then of course post 9/1 they've clamped down on it. But that's only a temporary inconvenience, and so lining that up with one or another, or the the Indonesian situation, I'm sure that in the next 3 to 6 months we will resolve either one or several ways to do that, because I definitely, personally, and for everybody in Pantera, know that once we do perfect and finish the status correction, we have to send back the U.S. passport.
Sorry, is there anybody, I had one more question, but if...
And actually, one other point is that there is also the line of, see now the Department of State of the United States is subservient to the Holy See. There's an ambassador who is sent from the United States through the Secretary of State to the Holy See in Washington, D.C. And when we do our international will, which we will have done in the next few weeks as the next step, as I described earlier, it will go to the Holy See, to the ambassador from the United States, to the Holy See, and to the birth state Secretary of State. And so that's another probability that once that's all done and we confirm the severance to the civil commercial side, that we can then send our passports to the Secretary of State and basically just say, you know, we want a national or American passport. Okay, so those are all sort of in play.
Okay. Last question is just hypothetical here. Say I go through all those standing and process and part of the society, but then there's an inheritance of a family business that's divided among other children, and I'm one of, but that business is an LLC. Any problems there?
No.
Okay.
That, when you do the foreign trust, and you do a UCC1 where the foreign trust is a secured party, so the foreign trust is a fiction. It's private. It's not a statutory trust. And, but you do a UCC1, you convey all, and a UCC3 behind it, you convey all right, title, and interest to the franchise, to the property. Now the executor of the estate steps in and does what needs to be done to dissolve, liquidate, settle, and close claims and liabilities. So you have property rights, title, and interest, which would include beneficial interest from a franchise estate to another franchise or multiple franchises. And so then that interest in that estate just goes to the foreign trust. And we already have one bank, just because we haven't branched out to other banks, but Bank of America cooperates with us in opening up foreign trust accounts for the foreign trust without U.S. corporate ID and without a social security number, just the foreign ID number for the trust and the World Service of Passport as the primary ID, and an international driver permit for a secondary. So all of that is already integrated into the status correction process. I don't think I mentioned, but a big part of my focus from the mid-90s onward was asset protection, pure trusts, which are private contract trusts, international stuff. I've extensively traveled for years, you know, long before my engagement with law and so forth, but basically from the early 90s, mid-90s, pursuing the international arena with jurisdictions. We have very strong networked relationships all over the world: the Bahamas, Belize, Panama, Costa Rica, Hong Kong, Vanuatu, and so forth, for banking. That was one of my primary goals, which is to have our own in-house banking and other asset and financial management infrastructure, which we have a lot of network relationships, and post-RV we will mobilize having our own bank or banks and otherwise. So, oh, I know why I talked about it, because my background was in creating trust, contract trust, corporation, sole, all the rest. All of that, once that epiphany happened 14 months ago that I described earlier, I have integrated all of that into a very comprehensive whole, using now our court, which goes back to recording that original document in Washington in February of 2002, and understanding which I woke up, as I described earlier, to the fact that, hey, like Dorothy, I have everything, I'm already home. We have the society that has 12 years plus history. And a private society has complete precedence in law going about back 600 to 800 years in English law to have its own court, have its own treasury as a bank, have its own self-governance, all of that. If you look at the PanteraPCA.org website, all of those foundational documents and all of that structure is out there as public notice, and we're working to expand and integrate our data systems and our database and all of that for publication as a public record of various things, notices of trust and things like that. So our court now, for the last couple of years, almost 3 years now, issues orders to create trusts. So they are non-grantor trusts, and now I've integrated that. I've integrated all of my history with pure trust, contract trusts, and all the rest of it, and it's been totally recognized. Like, we open up those court-ordered trusts with accounts. We do get an EIN, but then it's layered properly to keep that firewall to separate the public side from the private side, and it's simply a banking trust. And then in the status correction and or the estate structure, if you want to create your own society and corp sole and so forth, whether you're on that side, the status side, or integrating using both, creating auxiliary trusts by orders of the court to move everything out of the franchise name. A service trust for utilities and phone, a carriage trust to register cars so that you don't have to drive around until you're ready to have self-made plates. Some of us have been there and done that, and it can work, but it's just easier to just have a very neutral kind of private conveyance that you have in a trust that's not in commerce. And so we create a carriage trust to register in the state until we're ready. Post-RV, then we can get rid of that. Buy new cars, get the MCO, manufacturer's certificate of origin, and then we'll create our own plates and all the rest of it. So as I described earlier, being smart, not in their face, has been my policy. But post-RV and or other events that I'm sure are going to happen soon, we'll have the ability to just completely walk out of all of it. And I'm preparing, we're preparing to do that. So we create those court-ordered trusts for the utilities, for the cars, to hold interest in an LLC. Justin operates through an LLC. He's got partners who, and I've got other people who have partners who don't want to have anything to do with this. It doesn't matter. An LLC can have 3 partners or 3 members who are just operating through their franchise, and the 4th one who puts interest in a holding trust. And then the beneficiary of that is the corp sole or the foreign trust or any combination. So we've perfected all of those solutions, and it's all ready to go.
2 questions. The first is, when you establish the trusts, are you publishing the trust with the ID number you're referring to, so the bank has a third-party reference to search?
Well, if we're doing anything in the public, for one, these are non-grantor trusts because they're created by order of an ecclesiastical court, okay? By the way, it's been looked at up and down by 2 legal departments, Bank of America and Wells Fargo, and you can guarantee if they are okay with it that we've cut mustard as far as what's proper in terms of their system. But again, to be seamless without having to hide in a cave or otherwise, if it's going to be in the public, we create it by court order, we get an EIN, we go online. If the beneficiary is going to be the foreign trust as opposed to the corporation sole, we get it as a trust so that we name the foreign trust as both the responsible party and the trustee. Okay, and then we use it for one purpose or the other. If it's going to come to the corporation sole, it's on the online system, it's done as a church-controlled auxiliary.
Okay.
And so if it has an EIN, if it needs one to operate functionally on that side of the fence, we get the EIN, and then we have the letter from the IRS. So the bank takes the letter from the IRS and our court order for the trust, and a couple other affidavits and declarations that ensure that on the record there's a separation between the living and the dead, and Wells Fargo and or B of A are totally fine with that.
Also, I haven't heard you mention anything about whether Pantera is going to establish a new nation. Is that in the plan?
Well, in the documents we've put out to the world bodies and to the Holy See, we assert and we stand as an ecclesiastical sovereignty and define that as the ecclesia, the body of the congregation, which is a body politic. And so we are a body politic, you know, as an ecclesiastical body, non-denominational, non-religious, so to speak, but still an ecclesiastical body that has totally been accepted and recognized throughout the system. So a nation, no. A nation is a corporation where a living being is captured into a franchise bankrupt construct, okay? And but as a sovereign body politic, and it could be splitting hairs to say that it operates in the system as what I just described. It can also say we're a private nation, but that's what I learned when we were involved with the Dominion of Melchizedek. What was acceptable with the system, calling it a non-political ecclesiastical sovereignty made it work. Trying to assert it as, say, a member of the United Nations or something like that doesn't work. But it's an ecclesiastical sovereignty, a private society, and having its own court and the rest of it. But now, ultimately, when we complete our status correction, we have the standing that I described and can state and stake a claim on the land, the first time one of us does that, which will probably be me, then that land becomes sovereign territory. Okay, now we have land and territory. So by all the rules of the law of nations, and if you read Vattel's Law of Nations, the first thing, the very first entry clause or whatever article also refers to a society of men, okay, as a nation or amongst the law of nations. So that's what we are, but we include women too. And
You answered my question.
yeah, because who wants to be stuck with a bunch of men dressing up in ladies' clothes like Rome does? I prefer the company of women. So, okay.
I love all the history that you've been discussing today. Would you mind maybe throwing me a couple of websites or audiobooks or real books or documentaries or anything that maybe I could go check out and play around with?
I wouldn't mind at all. Would you mind becoming a member of Pantera? And it's
Yeah.
all on the Gemstone site and growing every
Sweet.
day.
Okay, I'm definitely into that.
Good.
So let's say that we went ahead to take a course of correction, set of correction, and how will we be guided? I wonder if, I think I will face a lot of difficulties, how I can guide myself, or is it a complete self-guided course?
It's both. The Gemstone site and the status correction course is structured as a self-directed guide and sequential step. It is fairly complex, and we're refining it and improving it all the time. As much as we are able to, and still we're small enough to have that personal interface to be there, one person or the other, to assist. But as people are walking through that, members who are doing it and getting more competent and integrated with it, because Pantera is a mutual benefit society. It's not hierarchical. So those who are gaining the benefit of perfecting their status by doing that, it's not mandatory. Nobody's going to, force somebody to do it, but we're encouraging everybody to be available under that principle of mutual benefit, to be there to assist and support new people, and especially people who are, maybe less advanced in their understanding, to be there. So that's...
Openly, we can ask questions to peers.
Yeah, and we have it set up. We're building a frequently asked question compendium, and there's a place to send questions, and it's getting better and better all the time. Always understanding it's a work in progress.
Testing 1, 2. Okay. All right. If you have a corporation sole, you mentioned the auxiliaries. If you're going to create an auxiliary of that corporation sole, would it be a DBA of the corporation sole,
No.
or the body politic?
Or what's the last?
Or the body politic that you mentioned?
Well, Pantera is a society. A corporation sole is created out of the society as an office. All the assets that either are vested into that office or accrue and build as the office goes forward belong to the office. So the overseer occupies that office. It's a singular office, and directs the assets to be applied to whatever the overseer sees best, and primarily as a fulfillment of the intent in the mission statement of the society. So it's definitely not a DBA, because that's a commercial term. It's my franchise doing business as this name, but it's still attached to the social or the corporation, again, in the public, in commerce. The auxiliaries are simply an extension of the office to hold assets or do other functions. It's called multi-layered, multi-jurisdictional structure. You can operate in the domestic jurisdiction through commercial entities in the United States as an LLC, if required. You can create a private trust. You can be the beneficiary of a statutory trust, like the inheritance issue. You can, a lot of different things. You can go offshore if you have international activity and use the different jurisdictions that we work with in Panama and Vanuatu and Hong Kong and so on and so forth to create international corporations. And that's what you learn in the estate structure course, as far as building the multi-layered structure around that core of the corporation sole, the office, which we do not publish, record, or register anywhere other than in the private record and archive of our own court. But we do public notices. And so if there's a necessity to notice the public, we have either a declaration or statement and decree or other variations to tell the public what it needs to know, so that they will conform to what they're required to do.
Okay, understood. So I was hearing, because I was under the impression that the corporation soles were registered with particular states like Washington.
Well, that's what most people think.
Wow,
Okay, so you take a private structure. See, when the Catholic Church goes and registers and records a corporation sole in Nevada, Arizona, Utah, wherever, they don't care because they control it anyways. Okay, and then a lot of people started investigating and learning that, and they started reproducing that. But you're going right back in where you register something, you're giving it back to the Crown. Okay, so any statutory authority that you quote in any document that you create a corporation sole is going to put you into the statutory jurisdiction.
Wow.
So the one time that I put anything into the public was titled Articles of Acknowledgement, and explicitly stated, and we recorded in Washington State in 2002, explicitly stated what we were and what we were not relative to the jurisdiction of the corporate state, and specifically not giving them any grant of jurisdiction. So from there, to fulfill the mission of Pantera, we created the Private Contract Association, which is totally private. And then we've created the court, which is totally private. And then everything else I've described, so that all of what you create in the private environment of our court and society is totally private and does not traverse into the public. And as I described, there's a firewall. If and as necessary, you create a standalone entity that can be like a projection into the commercial side to do a specific function, hold a bank account or
Okay,
so
Liz.
forth. So,
Okay. Thank you.
and soon enough, we won't even need their banks, and or other things will happen with their banks that are coming soon down the line. Yay, the court jester agrees.
I will. I just had one more question, Ken. I'm basically committed, and let's say 99%.
Hey, court jester, did he buy 5 question tokens? No. Okay. I think
got
he
it right
only
here.
bought 3. Was it 3 for $10? Oh, he's got one. Okay, good.
Yeah, there's a special going on right now. Picked it up at Walmart. I just wanted to say really quick, I'm basically committed to at least, 100% committed to saying I'm just going to make sure I have ultimate clarity, and then I'll go forward with joining. But that being said, I'm a young guy with a young family, and how does PCA hold husband and wife type of covenant relationship and children coming in? Because my goal in all my study here is to correct status and standing in capacity for my whole family and my
Yeah.
whole lineage going forward. So, but I don't know, how much money, you know what I mean, that sometimes factors into spending a lot of money for each individual. So
Yeah.
can you speak to that really quick? And
Sure.
then-
Well, first of all, did you marry under a state contract?
Oh, yeah, it was before I knew anything.
Right.
So we'll
It's okay. I got a
rescind
couple
that.
of those myself.
We'll revoke.
You simply, in the status correction, rescind that contract.
Correct.
Because obviously, until you do, the children belong to the state.
Right.
And the production of the corporate merger of the 2 franchises.
Right.
So, but once you do that, then you, as now the lawful guardian rather than the corporate ward of your children, can do the same thing for your children's birth certificates and so
Right.
forth. We make it as accessible as we possibly can for as far as costs. That the status correction and or separately, either one, the status correction or the estate structure, are a donation of 2,500 FRNs right now. If a couple does the estate structure, that's the same for either a single or a couple. If they do the status correction, each one has to do a contract with that, but
Sure.
somehow there's a discount with
Okay.
a couple. And basically the bottom line is, yes, we need inflow, not revenue, not income, but inflow
Sure.
of FRNs until the RV, and then it's not a problem.
Right.
We do have a significant amount of costs in terms of maintaining and building what we're doing. At the same time, we will work with anybody based on what, it's on the honor system. You tell us, we will contract for a total amount, but then it's a matter of what can you afford initially or on a monthly basis or whatever to make it work.
That's great.
But I know what people have paid and spent out there. I've done it in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for what I've got, and I know the value of what we have here is beyond calculation.
Yes.
And the more qualified, capable people such as all of you come on board, and see, the idea is for us to, once we're able to do it in a stable way, expand the court so that we have a St. Louis-based court, or we have a Seattle-based court, or San Antonio or wherever, and so that we can reproduce it, train, build competency and expertise and all the rest of it, and so forth. So the money coming in is going to build our society and build the infrastructure. And what I've told you is only a half of what's there. If I went into all the international stuff and what it's taken for me to accrue and integrate it, it's cost literally many millions of dollars to do. And I've seen people charge $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for the value, not even 1/10 of the value. Nobody has created what we've created: the society, the court, the notices, perfecting the body politic, the cognizance, et cetera, and the integration of all of it. So, we are actually going to increase those donation rates relatively soon.
Okay.
So see the court jester for a discount coupon
I will.
that expires on September 30th.
Okay.
But the bottom line is everything that anybody can do to help support it is very important. And at the same time, we will work with anybody on their level of means, because you're more important than the FRNs, although we do need the FRNs
Sure.
until we don't need them.
Clearly understood. We're all dying to hear about the currency revaluation.
Oh, I knew you were going to ask that.
No, he asked you a question.
Oh, I know, but we'll get one more and then we'll go to that question.
So I was curious your thoughts on Bitcoin. Do you see that as a public or private currency? Is that going to potentially play a role in some things that you're doing going forward?
I see it as a initial private construction that the cabal on the public side is moving very fast to try and co-opt into their system. I think it's a great idea, but I think it's going to be a throwaway that will evolve to other systems that will be much better prepared to do it and make sure it stays private. As big corporations are starting to accept it, and they're going to start moving into creating legal and judicial precedent to prove that it's taxable, then it'll be gone as far as a truly private currency. But it's a precursor to what's coming. There's already more coming, and I'm sure it's just going to explode. Kind of relates to that question, which now I will answer. Relative to, I hear music playing. Is somebody's phone ringing? It's not mine.
It's just your feelings. Put the aluminum foil head.
Hang on. Transmission coming in from Alpha Satori. Hello? Zork, is that you?
That's the big giant head.
I'm busy. I'm harvesting some. Yes, we'll be delivering them soon. Okay, sorry. Ignore that. Okay, your question, and then I'll ask his question.
I'll try to, hopefully this one will be brief. You just mentioned, I understood you to say a non-grantor trust. Could you explain what that?
Okay. Remember I described indenture? When somebody is a grantor, they're creating an indenture, and as far as specifically under the IRS code, that if you act as a grantor is simply, there are three, it's a triangle, three components of a trust. A grantor, or called a trustor or settler, who grants or settles something into a trust, into the corpus. And then the split title is, one side is the trustee who holds legal title and controls it, the other side is the equity, or the beneficiary has the equitable title. So the grantor grants the initial corpus. It could be a toothbrush or $1 billion, whatever It's 100% of the initial corpus. At that point, the trustee controls it and does whatever the document tells him he can or can't do. The document in a grantor trust is called an indenture, same as what I described as an indentured bond or indentured servitude. So the IRS looks at, if you go to an attorney and you create a trust, it's a grantor trust, and the IRS will look to the income generated in the trust as taxable at the rate that's applicable to the grantor. Okay, that's how the IRS rules work. Okay, so if you create a non-grantor trust with other components in it, it separates that jurisdiction that the IRS will claim. If you, as a U.S. person, act as grantor and put the initial corpus in, because then that trust will start generating, creating income, it'll be taxable to the franchisor or to you as the grantor. Does that make sense?
Not really. I mean, I've heard of grantor trust, and I'm familiar with pure trust and statutory trust and all this, but just the non-grantor, somebody's got to grant it over.
Not if it's done as a different kind of relationship. What we do, what a pure trust is, or a private contract trust, creates a contractual relationship between one party acting as a creator who enters into a contract with another party who acts as an exchanger. And the exchanger puts whatever is going into the corpus under a contract of exchange, under mutual and equal consideration. And so the IRS can't touch it as a private contract of exchange. So if I exchange by contract with you and you're creating the body of the corpus of the documents that create the trust and define the trustee and other relationships, then I can contract to exchange whatever I'm putting in, whether it's a toothbrush or $1 billion, and I get for that 100 units of beneficial interest in exchange. That's a perfectly valid, equal consideration private contract that the IRS has no ability to control. Okay, so that acts as the position of settlor or grantor as a non-grantor contract relationship. The units of interest become the beneficial units, just like bearer shares of a corporation, so that's the beneficiary. The rest of the document establishes the trustee and the relationship to the corpus and the ongoing management of that trust. So I took all that knowledge that I gained over 15, 18 years of experience from the mid-90s, and I translated it into the foreign trusts that we do for the status correction. So it's a non-grantor, private, and foreign trust that ultimately the board of trustees of the Pantera court are the trustees. The individual, the living man, becomes the executive trustee who can control it. The executor of the estate also is a trustee to do what's necessary to do that. These are all the things that you will learn if you engage and get involved with the status correction process. I can't give it to you all now, but you know.
I just always thought that a creator and a grantor were interchangeable, but I see where you're saying you have a creator, he brings in an exchanger, and then there's no grantor necessary.
Right. I mean, basically, technically, we call it a private contract of exchange in trust form. Okay.
Whenever we call the IRS to get the 98 numbers, they always ask us that question too, to try and trip you up. They'll say, when we're reviewing the SS4, when you're requesting the EIN number for the foreign trust, they'll set you up and they almost always will ask you, is this a grantor trust? If you tell them it's a trust, they'll say, is this a grantor trust?
Right. Yeah.
To try and gain jurisdiction over it.
So a lot of detail, but you know, we're just obviously touching on it and answering some questions, but this is all built into the course with all the detail. You know, I can't even hardly convey the quantum event of all of these pieces falling together like a multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. I'd been gathering all the pieces for 20 some odd years, and when it all came together, I mean, you can ask the court jester up there. I have been working night and day for the last 14 months, writing all these documents, rewriting things, converting them from commercial constructs into the private estate or the foreign trust or whatever. And you know, it's been my passion and my joy to do that in the last 15 months, because everything I set out to do to figure it all out and bring it together has come together in a way that I couldn't even have imagined literally even 2-3 years ago. And it's truly my joy to have all of you and those of you who decide to come on board with us to engage with it, because once you see the detail, I actually have all the templates of the documents. Maybe we'll do it tomorrow a little bit. They're very, very, very extensive documents, and there's a lot of people out there, you know, like what Jason was describing, getting a 98 number with the IRS as a foreign trust and doing the other things with the corporation and so forth. People are barely scratching the surface of it, and that's why I speak to the magnitude of the value, the quantum level of this all, and I am thoroughly excited of coming here for multiple levels of reasons, one being right here in the heart of the matrix. And everything else that we've talked about, but significantly because all of you have been studying what you've been studying and being in the MIC. Well, I brought the KEY, and now we've got Mickey. Now we just have to find Minnie, and we're off to the races. You know, when you get into it, you're going to see all of this, and you're going to learn, and we will all become masters of this, and then expand and build with it from here. And nothing can stop us, and there's nothing we won't be able to do. The original plan in 2003 was to bomb, as I said earlier, to bomb the shit out of the Shekinah or the Shekinah, the Shekinah, destroy the first Babylon and resurrect the new Babylon. To build the so-called U.S. Embassy as the new world capital, institute World War III, and basically have the Middle East decimate itself and collapse all of the world system to bring it to its knees. Because, among other things, during the last 60 years, everybody know what the Marshall Plan was post-World War II? Of course, we have the Bretton Woods Agreement, the pegging of the dollar as the reserve currency, and all of that. So the Marshall Plan evolved into a global settlement plan and various other levels of things that were underwritten by original assets that were controlled out of Indonesia, and a trust called the Swiss Indo Trust that was founded in Switzerland established in 1901 or 1902. There were other vast amounts of global assets that also came out of China. When I talked about the four corners and the Hopi using the swastika and what was going on with the caches of large amounts of gold, the same thing existed on the other side of the planet under the control of something called the Shaolin priesthood, which basically was connected to Tibet, where the other origin of the swastika emerged. So you have 2 points on the planet where the right-spinning swastika emerged as a symbol, and Hitler went to Tibet, or sent his people to Tibet, to get a lot of that esoteric knowledge and basically bring back the inversion, just like the pentagon is the inversion of the right-standing or properly oriented pentagram. And of course they invert it and use it to create war and destruction and all the rest of it. They did the same with the swastika. So it originated where these two very large amounts of gold wherever they may have come from over millions of years, were aggregated and put under stewardship of these two places on the planet. So you've got the Spanish, after Carlos V became the Holy Roman Empire emperor somewhere around 1515 to 1520, I forget the date, and then sent Cortez, take control of Mexico, go up to the Four Corners, start accessing the gold. In the meantime, the Portuguese sent ships over to China and established the first European colony called Macau, which is just below Hong Kong. And the purpose, because they knew from ancient records that the purpose for the Portuguese colony was to create the same kind of ingress. It was not as easy as in America. It took hundreds of years to access and get to the point where they were accessing the gold that was stashed and controlled by the Shaolin priesthood. The Shaolin evolved into something called the Plum Blossom Society. Anybody heard of the Plum Blossom Society? The Plum Blossom Society was essentially the extension of the Shaolin priesthood that controlled this vast amount of wealth under a system of generational control, or elders who were trained from birth to maintain that control. A similar lineage in Indonesia, under something called the Majapahit, which I'll get to in a minute. And eventually, the Western cabal was able to gain a modicum of access to that cache of gold in the 1930s through the Plum Blossom Society. The Plum Blossom Society went hand in hand with this guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the nationalist army movement that emerged after the last emperor fell in the mid-19-teens, and then the nationalists took over, and basically China was one big free-for-all for the next 2 or 3 decades until the nationalists emerged, consolidated in the early to mid-30s, and eventually later Mao emerged after the Second World War. But in the 1930s, post-1933, the Federal Reserve recapitalized its monetary system to do what we all know, what we've talked about a lot, and you all know the history from 1933 on. But they needed gold to underwrite the Bretton Woods Agreement that they were leading up to World War II, World Bank, IMF, UN, Bretton Woods, because the Bretton Woods said that the Federal Reserve note would be underwritten by the dollar for international settlements between central banks, which lasted until 1971. So they made a deal with the Plum Blossom Society and the Nationalist Army and Chiang Kai-shek to bring over vast amounts of gold and create historical bonds against that gold. Basically, here's our paper, we're good for it, don't worry about it, you just give us our gold, or your gold. And so that basically was initiated in 1934, and that's where some of that gold started moving to the West, but only a small portion, okay? Those Chinese and those Indonesians, they're pretty clever, and they have a long vision. And there's no limit to the greed of this Western cabal, who over generations and thousands of years believed that they were the masters of the world and were going to gain control over the whole world at the end of the cycle in 2012. So they were being set up, as far as I can see, based on a lot of what I have directly encountered and a lot of what I'm telling you. And so 1934, the gold started moving between 34 and 37 and 38. Here's our paper, you give us our gold. But there were other underlying constructs and agreements with the Swiss Indo Trust, with Switzerland, UBS, Union Bank of Switzerland, and the Indonesians, and so forth. And this is all what essentially underwrote the 20th century, the explosion of the fiat currency. The game plan of the cabal side was basically to create vast amounts of fiat off-book money, beginning with the Marshall Plan and going through 10-year cycles from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth. And basically, the biggest Ponzi scheme that the minds of men have ever created. Because what they would do is issue what are called midterm notes, which are 10-year notes, and create off-book trading platforms, which are called a high yield or variations on that theme. Anybody heard of this before? Okay. And basically issue a midterm note for $100 million with 7.5 annual interest, which would be, compounded about 75 to 90% over 10 years, but on an annual basis. And then all the Federal Reserve fractionalization and derivatives and all the multiplications and stuff, so that you would sell a $100 million note for, say, $30, $32, $33 million, and then bring that money in, fractionalize it, charge interest to the American public, build the American dream and all the rest of it, and then in 10 years roll it over and issue more notes and expand it and expand it. And then in 1971, peg that to the petrodollar and keep expanding the consumption of petroleum, so that you had to create more Federal Reserve notes because countries can only buy oil in Federal Reserve notes, and then the central bank system and putting all that Federal Reserve notes as the reserve currencies and all the rest of that. So that was basically the setup. And in 2003, George Jr. was instructed to do what he did, 911, all the excuses, WMDs, attack Iraq, Shekinah, and destroy old Babylon and resurrect the new Babylon. And first collapse the dinar, and then keep issuing that between 2003 and 2008, and distribute it to all the cabal cronies and mid-management political players, banking players, and all the rest of it, give them all the in. And the plan was in 2008 to collapse the world system. And over many, many years, from the 60s on, these successive cycles of midterm notes, 10-year notes, trading, creating all this off-book money, and creating all the off-book money on all of our estates worldwide, and accumulating these in banks. But the relationship to the Swiss Indo Trust required that a large amount of that accrued value was going to accrue in bank accounts in every bank in the world. And they did. And but their plan was to basically collapse the system. By the way, forgot to mention, the plum blossom has 5 petals. If you look on China Airlines, which is the nationalist China Taiwan logo, it's a plum blossom. And it has 5 petals that also they pretty much exactly a pentagram. Okay, another correspondence of that pentagram relationship. And the way the Plum Blossom Society would sign their documents is they would take their hand and put their 5 finger and thumb prints and create a plum blossom. That's how they would sign their documents. And so, but from what I know and what I've directly encountered and interface with, because along the line of figuring all the rest of everything out, Andrea and I found ourselves in all kinds of interesting situations and circumstances that I'm definitely not going to tell you tonight, but someday I will record and talk about the stories, because we've ended up right in the middle of the Philippines and Indonesia and China and the Plum Blossom Society and the elders and all kinds of, every component of all of this. It's a truly extraordinary and fascinating history that very few people know, but again, it's going to come out, and that's what Gemstone is gearing up to be ready to bring out there, the true history of all of this. Now, if you want to get part of that history, you look up a author whose name is Sterling Seagrave. Anybody know that name? Seagrave. He was born to missionary parents in Burma in 1937 and grew up in Asia, went through World War II over there, and became a researcher and a writer, and he wrote a series of books that tell most of the history, not all of it, not some of this core level of the issues with the gold and the plum blossom and all the rest of it, but he wrote a book called the Yamashita, he wrote the Marcos Dynasty, the Yamamoto Dynasty, which is the history of Japan from 1860 onward, how Japan was set up by the Rothschilds and the whole debasement of the Korean Peninsula, setting that up, and how Japan was moved to play its role in World War II. And he wrote the Marcos Dynasty, which is about Marcos coming into power, how he was put into position in the Philippines. He wrote a book called The Gold Warriors, which talks about Yamashita gold. Yamashita was the Japanese general who was in charge of sweeping all of Asia, about 16, 18 countries, and systematically raping all of the precious metals, artifacts from temples, solid gold Buddhas, gemstones, diamonds, you name it, in the barrel load, huge amounts, in shiploads. And after 1942, the U.S. blockaded Japan and prevented those ships from going back to Japan, so they had to go to the Philippines, which they controlled when they kicked MacArthur out of the Philippines, and they used the Philippines as the underground cache for all of that Asian loot. And then, of course, the Philippines is a Catholic country, so the Vatican had its meat hooks into it. And of course, it was a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War in 1898, when two trusts were created, one in the Philippines, one in Puerto Rico, which is the true Internal Revenue Trust. That is where all of the original charges originate in your master files, or the franchise master files, and through rules of commerce and the corporate collector called the Internal Revenue Service, which is a Delaware corporation, that they do what they do. So the Philippines became the catch-all for German gold that swept out of Europe, for the Italian gold through the Vatican, and Asian gold through Japan. So the Philippines became this huge storehouse of a huge amounts of gold. But underlying that was even more of the world's wealth that had been gathered over thousands of years through the Indonesian line, the Philippine line, the Royal Chinese line, the Shaolin, the Plum Blossom, and so forth. So all of that underlying collateral underwrote the 20th century banking extravaganza. The plan was to collapse all of it by 2008. And all of the off-book trading fiat currency that was created by this high-yield trading, and I'm not going to go into all the detail because I'm losing steam and I'm losing my voice, but I am leading to current what's going to happen with the RV. But all of that off-book trading that George Bush Sr. was in control of since the mid-70s, when he took control of the CIA and never lost control over it until recently, and then went through the Reagan years, and then his presidency, and then the Clinton years, and the Shrub presidency, and all the rest of it. Shrub means little bush, okay? that it was always bait and switch, and our friend Alan Greenspan was totally part and parcel of that in his position as chairman of the Fed. And basically they got warm bodies and asset holders and collateral holders to step up and to use their position as the trading contracted party, and they would do, except for in very rare circumstances, or unless you were part of the elite, they'd do a bait and switch and they would never pay the outcome. They would steal all the money. And it was all accumulated into the 90s, and that's why, among other reasons, the Kosovo War, or the, that whole Yugoslavian breakup war took place, because they took control of the Kosovo Central Bank and used that as a repository for that period of time until that got shifted. They used North Korea as a repository, they used Zimbabwe, and when they took over Babylon or Iraq, they moved it all into the Central Bank of Iraq. And the whole idea was to collapse the public system, the public fiat system, the bankrupt structure in 2008. And without going into detail, because I know some of it, but a lot of it I don't know, but I can extrapolate based on what I know and other factors that, that I've participated in, that by 2008, their game plan was not going to work. It was falling apart. The original plan was to collapse the entire public system. George Bushy, the shrub, was not going to leave the presidency, and they were going to continue to drop it into martial law, collapse the system, and basically institute the New World Order, the cashless society, and bring all of this off-book fiat currency into this system under their absolute control, and then Revelations was going to be fulfilled. You would not be able to eat or drink. All the FEMA camps would have been activated, and they were going to RV the dinar in 2008, and only several 100,000 people held dinar at that time. And they were going to basically institute the new Babylon and take control through the so-called U.S. Embassy, collapse the public system, bring all that off-book money onto the public system, and basically force the entire world population to either live under their control or die. So the FEMA camps would have been activated. None of us would be here today. Okay? Fortunately, we are here today, which tells you something. Because between 05 and 08, it didn't go the way they planned. If you think back about what happened in September of 08 and the dog and pony show, it wasn't working. They were going to collapse. They were going to try and collapse it at that time. Other parties were standing by waiting for them to try, and they were forced into a broken field run that's been going on for the last 6 years. Does this correspond to things you know?
It does.
Okay. So, among other things, that forced them to sign a treaty in May of 2010 with the man who was chosen to be the chief elder, if you will, the leading heir apparent, the next in line of the royal line of the Indonesian lineage, that related to a kingdom that existed many, many thousands of years ago, before the collapse of the Atlantean global civilization 12, 13,000 years ago, the remnants of which went to the British Isles, to Central America, to Egypt, and the Indus Valley in Asia, and that was the origin of the new rising civilization that then was co-opted by what has become the New World Order in the last 5,000 to 8,000 years. And and that's, for those of you who have seen the press release or know of it through other, the press releases that's on the public page of the Gemstone site, that talks about Sino as King or K.681. He's the 681st in the unbroken lineage of the royal line that came through Indonesia, originally before the so-called fall of Atlantis, all of Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, all the way to Borneo, and even including Madagascar, was one integrated kingdom. It was known as the Singasari Kingdom that then was converted. Singasari basically means the essence of the lion. Singapura was the throne or the seat of the lion that later became Singapore. And other places throughout Asia, the Sikh religion was based on that. It was all about the lion. It was sort of the counterpart to the western side of the lion, the sun god, and all the rest of that. And in the late 1400s, they converted that to call it the Majapahit, which means in their language, the bitter fruit. Because it's similar to what happened in the Hyksos period, that they were anticipating 500 years, just like the 9 hells in the Mayan Aztec system, 500 years of basically eating the bitter fruit, going through what we obviously know in the history of the last 500 years. And their tradition knew and held that it had to be endured, and what would come out on the other side was the settlement, the closure. And so that long-sighted understanding by these original stewards of the earth and so forth, at some level knew that that was required, and what would come out on the other side was the final collapse of that ancient, call it that ancient struggle between the two sides of our own consciousness, good and evil, and as manifested by the evil side in our good friends, the Bushes and the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and all the rest of it. And so they underwrote the Western financial system, either through the Plum Blossom Society, as I described, or Swiss Indo, and so forth. And when they were not able, the cabal, to collapse the system, bring forward all of that off-book money, because by that point they got chased out of the central bank of Iraq, and that's why they hit Haiti with that big earthquake. Remember Haiti? Within 24 hours, the entire U.S. military was in Haiti for humanitarian support, and then George Sr. and Bill Clinton were out there on TV. Well, we're going to help Haiti and just send your money here, and we'll help them. Not a dollar of which went to the Haitian people. But the military was there, and they took control of the island within 24 hours, and they took control of the central bank and its electronic facilities to move all of that over there. The last attempt to retain control over that, to try and bring that in. And ever since '08 through now, they blew up the Gulf of Mexico, the BP Horizon thing, Fukushima, various earthquakes, earthquake in New Zealand because New Zealand refused to allow their Sabbatean cohorts to be exiled there, and many other things. So it's all been collapsing for the last 8 years. So the original RV was only going to be a cabal-controlled event. And then they would collapse the public system, and then they would move in all this off-book, and then we'd have the New World Order and all the rest of it. Since it didn't happen, in 2010, Sino, the Indonesian king of that lineage, emerging out of that Majapahit tradition, as the basically seated head of the Indonesian elders, signed a treaty with all the top players, the Committee of 300, the Pope, the President, the Chairman of the Fed, the Secretary of the Treasury, Geithner, and various other players, the head of the IMF, Ban Ki-moon, the head of the UN, to resolve all this, to allow for all of that off-book money to accumulated in all those accounts to be redirected and applied to humanitarian rebuilding of the planet. Non-military, non-aggressive applications. Well, when the cabal broke that treaty and started blowing up things like Fukushima and so forth, basically they breached international law in the international treaty, and that gave him the authority to, in a sense, in effect, foreclose on all the corporate seals that had been underwritten by all the Swiss Indo assets and all the rest of it, including the Chinese and everything that I've described, and essentially default and liquidate the breaching tortfeasors known as the corporations. And he took control of all the corporate seals of the UN, the IMF, the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is public knowledge. It is on the internet. You can go to the Gemstone site, see the press release we issued there, and there's some links and places to go. And if you become a member, those of you already a member, we have some other things, and there'll be more soon inside Gemstone for members that go into detail and give you the links and so forth of where to find some more detail about this. So how does that relate to the GCR? Well, it's not going to happen, as I'm sure all of you know, until the cabal is completely neutralized, which is, as it appears to be, virtually done and very close. Basically, the Federal Reserve System is being liquidated so that all of everything that's out there in terms of all that fiat currency, commercial paper, derivatives, and so forth is going to be settled and satisfied and transposed or migrated into the new system. Though all of those historical bonds that were issued from the 19-teens, the 1920s and 30s, and on into later decades, have been held by various holders, various signatories, and so forth over the last 20 to 80 years. Those are in place now to be on platforms similar to the high-yield trading platforms, but they're going to be traded so that the proceeds will be properly distributed. Also now under Basel III Accords, the Basel III requirements are for proper capital-based ratios on what's in the banks. It's going to flush all of the shit out of the underworld of the cabal system. You know, all the drug dealers with mountains of fiat currency, Federal Reserve notes, who will not be able to prove their authenticity of holder in due course through legal means, are going to wake up one day with bonfire material and a lot of other things. So, yeah. And so, so everything has waited, and of course, in the meantime, 2008 until now, somewhere, anybody's guess, between 5 and 10 million people have bought dinar. They hold other currencies. There are other programs that were initiated in the 90s, all of which were initially bait and switch by the Bush cabal to get people lined up for capture, basically, and lots of other things. Well, they're all going to be granted. If you've ever seen terms prosperity packages or settlement packages, there's all kinds of programs. They're all going to be underwritten by all of this vast amount of the world's global wealth held by the Indonesian, Philippine, and Chinese elders that held them under their own tradition to endure the bitter fruit until the time was right to bring it forward and collapse once and for all the old system and bring up a new system. So the global currency reset requires all of that to be in place, everything to be structured so that all of the derivative and fiat stuff is properly transitioned so it doesn't collapse the world system as it was originally set up to do, and so that it will be repurposed, so to speak, to have underwriting with assets, whether that's gold or national assets or commodities and all the rest of it. And now it includes the reset or the revalue of the dong, the dinar, and all the rest of that. So does that answer your question? Oh, that question. So the historical bonds are going to be, as we understand it, are already actively being traded. The proceeds will go in part to the bondholders for a reasonable settlement, in part to governments to recapitalize their banks and their treasuries and remove the Rothschild central bank system, and then to underwrite all of the revalue of the currency. So when you see people out there saying, well, there's not enough money in the world to do that, they're thinking in the old paradigm. They're thinking Federal Reserve notes or all the rest of it. It ain't going to happen, you know. But on the public view, the masses of America and all the world, all they're going to do is see incremental changes like have happened in the last 20 years. Oh, there's a new currency now. They won't know what it is. They'll just know that, you know, okay, well, you don't have this currency now, and you have this one, and now it says United States Treasury note instead of Federal Reserve note. They're not going to know what that means, but they're going to be educated to come to understand that. And so it is properly structured, so it will be seamless. All the fear-mongering and end times stuff, we'll call it stuff, that's out there is nothing more than the residual inertia of all the programs that people have been indoctrinated with for hundreds and thousands of years to believe the world's coming to an end. So I like this end of the story better. I am definitely an eternal optimist, and I always believed somehow we'd figure out a way out of this mess. But that's only the beginning. Then we have the real work, which is to actually, once the cabal is out of the way, clean up this mess in this planet, because it's vast, as you all know. And so, again, that's why Pantera is structured the way it is, to be a participant and be part of the solution to do that. So the answer to when is, who knows? But I know it's soon. I know it's before the end of this year. Okay, and I could be wrong. It could take into the new year. It's not a matter of when, it's a matter of the completion of all the requirements. I truly believe at this point, from what I know and what I've seen, that the structural requirements are all in place, and most of the cleanup is in place. I am quite confident that almost all of the cabal players, the middle players, certainly all the top players, are identified and are being tracked in real time, in every second of every day, and they have nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, and all their plans of going underground or to Paraguay or to Mars ain't going to happen. And so I don't know when. I think soon. I think probably in the next 90 days, but it could be longer. It could be tomorrow.
About the relationship with the Dragon family? The Dragon family?
They're all interrelated. You know, they relate to the Plum Blossom Society, the elders, different factions. However, how much of that is fully true and how much is a little distortion, I don't know. But I believe that that will be clarified once it's all starting to come to the surface. So they're just part of that Asian structure that I've described.
Is there anything that a little guy like me can do besides participating in something like Pantera to bring about this shift, in your opinion?
There's nothing that we can do with or without as Pantera to bring it about. It's already done. Okay, all but the last dotting of an I and a crossing of a T. But there's decades ahead of us of cleaning up the mess. And so my answer is, becoming part of Pantera. Let's build Pantera. Let's build the social and all the rest of it. The social, I mean the society and the law structure. Prepare for Gemstone to be a vehicle for education and all the rest that we've talked about today. And see each one, it's designed so that each one of whomever chooses to create their own society, it's an infinitely replicatable template. You create your society, you define it by who you are. I see a corporation soul as a contract with your higher relationship, your higher self, however you define that, and that's a vertical out-of-time relationship. It exists as the eternal essence of who you are. Who you are. The horizontal relationship is that it's a perpetual office. So you create the mission society, you create the office, the assets accrue to it. Now the assets that accrue to that office through the banking or moving into the new system are there to be applied as you see, as you create your society, your mission, and so forth. Pantera was designed to be the framework and the structure so that we could bring people in, educate them, reproduce the template, and be like universes nestled in universes, the way we actually were once about 300 billion years ago, before we collapsed into this singularity called... Right, yeah. So we've collapsed ourselves into the maximum density and the maximum separation. Now we're returning. Is it out there? No, it's right here. But we can reproduce our original nature as the center of the universe, create our own society, embody it in a corporation soul as a perpetual office, begin to build the legacy that you're designed to do, and send it into the future, and do it together as an aggregate of many constellations, societies, universes, and go out and, you know, clean up the world. That's my vision that I had many decades ago and been building towards now. Thank you for showing up now. Let's go do it.
What's going to happen to the price of gold, food, gasoline when all this happens?
It will stabilize. It hasn't been a bad idea to own gold and silver, but I think all of that survivor kind of prepper stuff is going to become very irrelevant very soon. Gold can be manufactured out of anything, and there's so much gold on the planet that, you know, it's only become a valuable monetary unit because of the control of the Rothschilds and the Rothschild Bank and the constriction of supply and demand through the artificial nature of the last 100 to 300 years. Okay? If you say there's only this much gold and you control it through the London fix and everything in the world system, the central banks and the Fed and blah, 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 and everything else, and then you make it go up when everybody thinks it's going down, and you get all the sheeple to buy it, and then you collapse it, and then you sell here and buy there and so forth. You just keep on harvesting more and more of the value. Well, when that breaks apart and there's an abundance of gold, and we start by underwriting the new system with all this vast hold of gold, that this amount that the Rothschilds controlled is this size compared to this entire room or this entire campus, then it becomes only a transition to stabilize everything. And then, you know, banking or monetary structure is simply saying there's a unit of value and a unit of measure. Okay, that's called a parity system. What we know as economics and monetary structure and banking is their whole controlled system. They devised it in the Hyksos period 3,000 years ago, and they kept iterating it over thousands of years, and it worked because we were all asleep and we all consented to it. You know, every breath I take has a unit of value. Every breath you take, every living being on the planet has value. Every square meter of land has value. You know, but they all put it into this containment, you know, only so much gold, so much Federal Reserve notes, and so forth, and that's why there's 2 billion people starving on the planet. And when we live on a water planet, they say there's, a shortage of water. It's been proven that a centimeter of air holds more energy than is required to run Los Angeles in a year. Yet we have an energy crisis, et cetera, et cetera. It's all a lie. Everything that we've been taught since the day we were born is a lie, built on the principle that we bought into called lack and limitation, to turn us into surviving rats fighting in a cage to see who gets the morsel that's been thrown in. It's not a very nice paradigm, and we can see the results of the last 500 years.
We got a couple more questions, and then we probably need to wrap it up, guys.
What's your opinion on the kind of connection, the BRICS?
BRICS Bank?
Yeah, Brazil, Russia, and the plan, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and those BRICS role on the new plan you just talked about. Yeah.
Well, it's been part of the transition, and I can't say that I know where it's going to end up. If you look at a lot of what the BIS and the world system, the Western system, have been doing, is creating something called a SDR, which is special drawing rights. Yeah. To be the new world currency. That's the old system. That's not going to happen. It is going to transition. Where BRICS lies in relationship to that and everything else that's going on, I'm not exactly sure, but it's all transitional. And probably, the BRICS central bank or development bank is not going to go away. It just may not necessarily be on old monetary structure, but we're in transition. It's probably going to take 10 to 20 years for this to all feather out and become stabilized, while the world tries to figure out what to do when it doesn't have the control systems that it's had, and the people on the planet have to stop behaving as maniacs the way they have for the last, 300 billion years.
The reason why I asked that because somebody did a rumor that BRICS, Russia, for example, is tied to the elders.
Yeah, it most likely is, but I don't know for sure, so I don't want to go there. So let's wrap it up. Any one last burning question?
One last burning question? We'll sell the last burning question if we got.
Yeah, Ken, do you think as the corporate structure starts to crumble, assuming that that's going to go with the cabal and all that, that we may see a release of or a return to liberty for some of these nonviolent corporate policy offenders?
Absolutely.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
fantastic.
Okay, because all it is a matter of the commercial bonds that are holding them there as surety and collateral and warehousing and all the rest of it. So yeah, when you get onto the gemstone site, there is an area called a menu item called emergence, and you'll see some more detail what's going on with Sino in Indonesia and other things related to that, something called the Office of Military Settlement, which we're very integrally involved with, which is essentially being positioned to settle all of that. So, it's going to take years. You can't just go open it up and throw these guys out and so forth, but, basically I know that we're right at that beginning point. So whenever it happens, just settle into knowing it's done, and then the real work starts. And compared to most of the cultures on the planet who have held this, the Majapahit, the Indonesians, the Chinese, the Filipinos, etc., what they've had to endure makes what we've been through look like a cakewalk. So be very thankful that we were fortunate enough to incarnate into this system and just have to fight what we fought. I'm sure this people paid some heavy prices in the fight here in the last 50 years, but compared to what those cultures had to deal with, you just, you don't even want to know. But we will make it known, The world needs to really wake up to know what we've all agreed to. In America in particular, we collectively agreed to this empire, and as long as we got our SUVs and our gas and everything else, just do what you got to do, well, there's a lot of people who are going to have to deal with that, that karma, if you will. Okay, let's call it.
So what do you folks think of how, can we thank Ken for coming and visiting with us? And of course, we don't want to forget the court jester.
Court jester.
Court jester.
All right, everybody, thanks. We'll see you over there, or see you in the morning, or...
If you don't come, safe travels, and again, God bless you all.